I wanted to rebroach a topic I'd done before, talking about the book Ordinary Men by Christopher Browning, and essentially the background argument that's going on. Essentially, we're talking about a bunch of material in terms of records and interviews that's been poured over by multiple different people, and people come up with different conclusions. And essentially, the underlying argument uh, is what happened in Germany unique to the German people because of certain things that didn't happen with other peoples, or is what happened to Germans in terms of being led astray to do brutality something that can happen to any people? And Christopher Browning has been pretty good about things. He actually, in a later edition, addressed Danial Goldhagens' contentions about the Germans being a unique people, whereas Browning leans in the direction that this is a human condition, not a German condition. And recently I was digesting new information from one of my favorite sources of information, TIK History, Tick, where he's been going into some of the background that leads up to what makes the German socialist government of the 30s and 40s actually able to do what they're doing. And part of what he's brought forward is talking about uh, how the Volk movement, or we'll call it the Volk concept, came into play. And essentially, it was this kind of mystical occult thing that actually came out of Russia that created Aryan race theory, with the idea that uh, the German people were the special people, and then on top of that, other outliers with the Aryans. And so this is something that built up slowly over through the 1800s and would eventually help fuel uh, the more benign German nationalism we see leading up to the unification of Germany in the 1870s, and the tamer but not so benign version of nationalism that helped drive World War One. And I'm certainly not blaming Germany for World War One. Nationalism kind of gets a bloody nose for that entire conflict. But so this Volk concept almost starts leaning towards the idea that maybe Browning is onto something here. That maybe there is something different about the Germans that make them more susceptible or more willing to believe this. So let's kind of get into this. So, one of the things we have to remember is that Germany starts off as a source of high culture. Uh, it was a source of great educational achievement. We're talking about a country that spawned uh, all kinds of music, all kinds of theatrical productions, very high end science of all types. They were leading edge on all this stuff. And I don't think you get that kind of drive on science in terms of expanding things without powerful culture behind it. And a critical thing to understand is that the German states prior to unification and even afterwards, uh, Germany was considered a safe haven for Jews. And then this country, that's this a source of tolerance, culture, uh, manufacturing might, and all these essentially good qualities, over the course of 13 years, lose their collective mind and go beyond the mere idea of a pogrom to essentially the attempted extermination of a whole group of people. How does this happen? So, was this a unique phenomenon that only Germany could have, or could it be replicated elsewhere, or worse, anywhere? So, the book Ordinary Men, Reserve Police Battalion 101 and the Final Solution. First of all, it's a fantastic book. It's great source material if you want to understand what was going on. But it is the kind of book that can cause you to lose a little bit of sleep because there are implications here that are very, very. It's not how your mind wraps around things because you're actually getting into the psychological profiles of the people who do this. And you get to a point where you're actually, I don't want to say empathizing, but you're walking in their shoes and you're starting to watch how their minds start justifying things. Where on one hand, part of their mind seems to be working perfectly well, and then the other part of their mind is dealing with the orders they've been given. Now, the thing to understand what makes Ordinary Men this outstanding book is it basically has an incredible ton of source material that it comes from. Essentially, the Reserve Battalion kept meticulous records about all the people in the unit, what was happening during the time, and because this particular unit didn't get tagged as being part of the final solution, many of them ended up going home. And then what ends up happening is as through the years, because these people are known, they are interviewed at maybe like 10-year intervals, give or take. And not only can we see what their mindset was about what happened immediately afterwards, we can see how they're actually comparing their own case study against themselves, how their mind drifts and deals with this over time. Uh, the critical thing about this book is that why we call them ordinary men is because these aren't the hardcores. These aren't the true believers in National Socialism. They are part of a reserve police battalion because they are considered to be the political unreliables, and they are also people who were essentially trying to avoid frontline duty. These are the people who are not the supporters of National Socialism. Understanding a little bit about the whole police system in Germany, because when we think of police, we tend to think of our American police system. Their system was pretty much nationalized from the get-go, especially following World War One, because they were using police training as a methodology of expanding their army without looking like they're expanding their army. And then the reserve police battalions were created with the idea that they would be the units that helped occupied conquer territories. What ends up happening is that these guys initially are just meant to be people maintaining order in the rear areas. And then as things go along, when Germany starts ramping up, when they rethink how the final solution is going to go, they get tasked with roundups, which they're not happy about, but they kind of go ahead and go through a process of exempting men who just aren't going to be able to do this. And then it starts getting worse where because of the mass roundups that are occurring in the East, the rail systems are actually backed up. Not enough trains to carry all the people who've been rounded up. And so they're given the order to, shoot and kill the people in place where they're at rather than round them up because there's no place open to send them to. And the book deals with how these individuals are able to work this out and do this. So we get to see the least reliable people of Germany, the ones who don't support the regime, become an integral part of the process. Now, Christopher Browning was not the first person to go over this material, but his book is probably one of the more famous ones. It got recommended by Jordan Peterson. And Browning, uh, he is of the mindset that this is a human problem and not a German problem. Uh, Showing that he's a great scholar. Part of the second half of the book actually gets into uh, Christopher Browning, who also went over the same material and came up with completely different conclusions. He believes the entirety of things was a German problem, that this was something that was unlikely to be replicated elsewhere, that the Germans were very unique in how they uh, were able to be sucked up into doing this. Now, one of the things Browning gets into is he brings up support material of psychological experiments that have occurred elsewhere. The photo here being the fairly famous Milgram experiment. And this is the one you may have heard of, where there's volunteers. Actually, the person who's like the patient or the recipient of things is actually an actor. And a volunteer is brought in to essentially apply electrical charges to the target. There's no real electricity involved, but the person who's flipping the switch and turning the dials believes it's really happening. And far more people were willing to do this than what might be expected. And you can look at the Milgram experiments online to get an idea what actually went on. We've also got the Stanford prison experiment, where students were split up into guards and prisoners, and even in a completely controlled situation where both sides knew it wasn't real, they both started assuming their roles and started acting out very much as how prison inmates and prison guards would work. And we have the third wave, which was a high school teacher who uh, basically started up his own little national socialist government inside a high school, and actually got the students and some of the faculty to follow along with him. And I would say the thesis of this is that humans can be directed to do horrible things. But I think both researchers kind of miss part of the issue. Yes, the masses can be led, and the masses can be stirred up. And when the masses are stirred up without leadership, the massacres and atrocities they tend to perform are limited. The horrors only really become truly epic when the masses are coordinated to do so by the establishment of the country. Um, for instance, if we compare the Russian and Eastern European pogroms of the 1800s, uh, they kind of pale in comparison to what was done with the Holocaust. And those were generally not government directed, those were spontaneous uprisings. Uh, but very frightening for the Jewish people nonetheless. They did a lot less damage. Now, obviously, the Russian government was in a position at that time where they didn't actively do anything to suppress these pogroms either. But I think the element these guys are missing is the establishment element of things. The evidence of history tells that international socialism or communism is capable of absolute brutal thuggery. Russia and China committed atrocities that, in scale, at least match or exceed German National Socialism's crimes against humanity. The Russian and Chinese people are very different from each other and very different from the Germans. Yet all these people were fully capable of being ordered to commit mass murder. So I don't think the German people were in any way special in this regard. Now, the Germans did make an attempt at communism. The uprising of 1918 ended up appearing to, or ended up seizing control of broad swaths of Germany. However, the same German people who would carry out the plans of National Socialism a couple decades later were not stirred to do the same for international socialism or communism. The reason was that the German establishment was fully intact and putting all their effort into making sure communism was not going to be the order of the day. The German establishment was united under the concept of guiding the government away from the parliamentary system imposed on it by the Allied powers in order to form a strongman system with a weak parliament like it had under the Kaiser. Their goal was to eventually seat the deposed crown prince as head of government. By an unfortunate joining of events, Hitler ended up being in the right place at the right time to step into the strongman position. He cleverly told all the factions what they wanted to hear. They accepted him as a suitable replacement for the monarchy. The establishment allowed National Socialism to take over for a mix of reasons. Parts of the establishment didn't really care about the National Socialist plans, as long as their concerns were met. Some knew what the plans were, but didn't believe they would actually ever go that far. Some thought National Socialism could be replaced down the road if things worked out poorly. Yet others feared international socialism or communism so much that they would accept anything as an alternative. The one way the German people were truly unique is the intellectual and spiritual ground had been seeded with the idea of Volkish superstition throughout the 1800s. The Volk ideas are what spawned Aryan race theory, which was the foundation for National Socialism. Both authors are partially right. Christopher Browning is right in that all humans can be led to do bad things. Danial Goldhagen is right that there were some unique aspects of the German people in terms of Volkish and Aryan beliefs. Where Goldberg appears to be wrong is that he asserts the German people had centuries of anti-Semitic conditioning, which led up to this. This thesis ignores, or at least seems to ignore, the fact that Germany, through World War I, was considered a haven for the the Jewish people, who were fleeing the Russian and East European pogroms. By 1914, German anti-Semitic parties had pretty much ceased to exist. One interesting side effect, one of the reasons why Britain created a Jewish state that would eventually become Israel was primarily because they feared that Germany was the center of Jewishness in Europe. And they needed to undermine that to create a potential for victory. And one of the ways they did that is they thought by creating a Jewish-run state that they would get all the Jewish people of Europe over to their side and away from the Germans. That's pretty convoluted stuff, and you can look at my Israel series if you want to get into more of that. But it was one of the motivations. Germany was not a bad place. In fact, the Jewish World Council functioned out of Germany up until the beginning of the National Socialist period. Another thing to remember is Kristallnacht, the night where essentially Jewish shops' windows were broken, was actually very unpopular in Germany. It was so unpopular that it was the only open attack against the Jews in Germany. From that point on, all the other repressions were done as secretly as possible and out of the sight of people as much as possible. It was so unpopular that the actual functions of the camps, once they went to their ultimate design, it was the highest level of secrecy, and it was actually punishable by death to release it. If the National Socialists believed the Germans were natural anti-Semites, wouldn't they be touting their incredible accomplishments that are occurring in the camps rather than keeping it secret? And another good point would be looking at the propagandist Fritz Hoppler, who uh, basically made some of the more famous propaganda movies of the war. If you've seen any of the anti-Jewish propaganda, it's probably his stuff. And he's on record saying that uh, over in Eastern Europe, it was really easy to work amongst the Poles and other Slavic people because they had a natural uh, anti-Semitic bent to them. He said it was difficult to convince Germans to go that way because they did not have a natural bent towards this. Now, Browning's thesis is valid without acknowledging the impact of establishments. However, if he had, I think his thesis would completely overpower Goldhagen's arguments. So, in the comments below, tell me, have you ever read Ordinary Men, and what kind of impact did it have on you? Anybody familiar with this Volkish movement stuff? Do you think it sways the argument one way or the other in terms of who might be more correct, Browning or Goldhagen? And if you have any other observations on how easily different nationalities are led, please smash the like button. If the YouTube algorithm brought you here and you're not one of my regular subscribers, please look at all my titles. I get into a lot of different topics. Please subscribe. And if you know someone who might find this interesting, please share it with them. Thank you for spending time with me this evening. Hope to see you again in a future video.